My name is Noah Whitfield. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been known as the dependable one, the man people trust to keep things running smoothly without needing recognition. I work a stable, professional job. I show up on time. I listen more than I speak. And I've learned that when you live that way long enough, people stop seeing you as someone with edges, limits, or breaking points. They see you as background. Friends often describe me as calm. My wife used words like easygoing and understanding. And while those traits sound flattering, there's a quiet assumption that comes with them, that you'll tolerate more than you should, that you won't push back, that you'll absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel it. Over time, that assumption can harden into expectation. This story isn't about a single moment of betrayal. It's about how betrayal evolves when it's allowed to happen in plain sight. It's about what it feels like to realize, slowly, unmistakably, that the people closest to you believe you won't act, not because you can't, but because you never have. The setting was a wedding, a mutual friend's wedding to be precise. One of those events designed to celebrate loyalty, partnership, and shared history. The kind of place where smiles are rehearsed, glasses are raised, and everyone plays their assigned role. I was seated 2 tables away from my wife, close enough to see her clearly, close enough to notice who she was with, far enough that no one expected me to matter. What happened there didn't unfold with shouting or confrontation. There was no dramatic interruption, no public accusation, no scene that guests would whisper about on the drive home. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, a shared understanding, unspoken but obvious, that I was being tested, that my silence would once again be mistaken for acceptance. As you listen to this story, you won't hear about revenge. You won't hear about humiliation or rage. What you'll hear instead is how small dismissals accumulate, how roles get assigned without consent, and how a person can become invisible even in their own marriage. You'll hear how silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a form of clarity rather than surrender. This is not a story about winning. It's a story about seeing clearly for the first time, about choosing restraint not out of fear, but out of certainty, and about understanding that dignity doesn't always announce itself. It often moves quietly, leaving consequences behind without ever raising its voice. I'm telling this now because some experiences only make sense in retrospect, and because there are people listening who may recognize themselves not in what was done to me, but in how long I allowed it to continue. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever realized that the people around you felt comfortable crossing a line simply because they believed you'd never stop them? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I was to the people around me long before that wedding. I was the reasonable one, the safe one, the man no one worried about offending because I never made offense visible. In group settings, I was the listener, the one who nodded, smiled politely, and let conversations move past me without resistance. If plans changed, I adapted. If someone forgot to loop me in, I filled in the gaps myself. Over time, that adaptability stopped being appreciated and started being expected. In my marriage, that role was even more defined. I handled logistics, stability, and the invisible work that keeps a shared life running. Bills were paid. Schedules were remembered. Conflicts were smoothed over before they could grow sharp edges. When something bothered me, I was careful about how and whether I voiced it. I believed that maturity meant restraint, that love meant choosing peace over ego. My wife often said she admired how unbothered I was. Friends joked that nothing ever rattled Noah, and I let that image stand, even when it wasn't entirely true. Because correcting it felt unnecessary, because explaining your inner life to people who are comfortable not seeing it feels like a losing proposition. Among our friends, I occupied a similar space. I was included, but not centered, present, but not essential. If someone needed help moving, I was called. If someone needed advice, I was consulted privately, but rarely acknowledged publicly. I became useful in quiet ways and invisible in visible ones. At the time, I told myself this was just adulthood, that not everyone needs to be the focal point, that respect doesn't have to be loud, and for a long while that explanation worked. What I didn't notice, what I couldn't see yet, was how subtly the tone shifted. Jokes at my expense that landed a little too easily. Decisions made on my behalf without checking in. Conversations that continued as if my opinion were already known, or irrelevant. None of it was cruel in isolation. That's what made it dangerous. Each moment was small enough to dismiss, easy enough to rationalize. And I did rationalize it, constantly. I told myself people were busy, that I was reading too much into things, that being easygoing meant accepting that not every dynamic would be perfectly balanced. I took pride in being the man who didn't need reassurance, who didn't demand space, who didn't complicate things. But there's a difference between humility and erasure. I just didn't have the language for it yet. Looking back now, I can see how clearly I was categorized. I was the constant, the fixture, the person whose presence could be taken for granted because it had never been conditional. No one feared losing me, because I had never suggested that leaving or changing was an option. That's the part people rarely talk about. When you're consistently reasonable, others start to believe you'll remain that way no matter what they do. Your patience becomes a blank check. Your silence becomes consent. And your identity gets flattened into a role you never consciously agreed to play. I wasn't unhappy all the time. That's important to say. There were good days, laughter, and routines that felt comforting. But beneath all of it was a growing sense that I was living slightly to the side of my own life. Present, involved, but not fully regarded. And because nothing had exploded yet, because no line had been crossed blatantly enough to force action, I stayed where I was. I continued being reliable, continued being calm, continued being the man everyone assumed would always be there. Unchanged. That assumption would eventually become the foundation for everything that followed. But at this stage, I was still invisible in a way that felt almost voluntary, almost noble. I believed that being overlooked was the price of being trusted. I believed that if something truly mattered, someone would notice how I felt without me having to say it. I was wrong about that, the first time it happened. I almost missed it. That's the strange thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There's no sharp pain at first, no immediate sense that something has been damaged. Just a faint awareness that something isn't sitting quite right, followed by the temptation to ignore it. We were at a casual dinner with friends. Nothing formal, just a familiar table, familiar faces, the kind of night that blends easily into memory. At one point, my wife was telling a story about a recent trip she'd taken for work. I was there for part of it. I remembered the late-night call, the frustration in her voice, the way she'd leaned on me to help think through a decision. But as she spoke, the details shifted. She framed it as something she'd handled entirely on her own. The challenge, the resolution, the outcome. Clean, self-contained, solitary. Someone across the table praised her confidence. Another joked that she didn't need anyone's help. Laughter followed. I smiled, I nodded, and I felt that quiet, unfamiliar tightening in my chest. It wasn't about credit. That's what I told myself immediately. It wasn't about being acknowledged. I didn't need my name inserted into her story. But there was something else underneath, a sense that a shared experience had just been edited, and that I'd been removed without discussion. I waited for a glance. A pause, something that signaled awareness. It never came. The conversation moved on. Plates were cleared. Drinks were refreshed. And the moment passed, outwardly uneventful, inwardly recorded. Later that night, I considered mentioning it. The words formed easily enough. I could have said it lightly, casually. But then the familiar reasoning stepped in. It's not worth it. It's minor. You don't want to sound insecure. So I let it go. That was the first cut. Not because it was severe, but because it taught me something. It showed me how easily my presence could be excluded without consequence. How comfortable did everyone feel with that version of events? How quickly the room accepted a reality that I simply didn't factor in. After that, similar moments began to appear more often. A decision was made without me that affected us both. A plan discussed as if I'd already agreed. A joke that positioned me as passive, harmless, and optional. Each one was subtle enough to dismiss. Each one came with a ready-made explanation. And Amaman? I chose Diar's explanation. What made these moments sharper wasn't that others ignored them. It was that I noticed them. I remembered them. While everyone else moved on, I carried the details forward, stacking them quietly. Without commentary. Not out of resentment, but out of a growing need to understand the pattern. Because once you see the first small cut, you start recognizing the blade. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my behavior. On the surface, nothing shifted at all, but internally, something had begun to recalibrate. I was paying closer attention, not to what people said about me, but to what they assumed they could say without me responding. And perhaps more importantly, I was beginning to realize how much of my identity in these spaces had been defined by what I didn't do. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge. I didn't insist. Silence had been my default. I just hadn't yet asked myself whether it was still a choice. Once the first small cut had been made, the rest came more easily. Not because anyone suddenly became cruel, but because nothing happened after the earlier ones. No resistance. No correction. No visible consequence. And in social dynamics, what goes unchallenged quietly rewrites the rules. I started noticing how often my absence was assumed, even when I was physically present. Conversations about future plans unfolded as if my availability were guaranteed. Decisions were made in advance, then presented to me as updates rather than questions. There was an unspoken confidence in how others spoke around me, as if they already knew the answer would be yes, or silence, or acceptance. And most of the time, they were right. I told myself I was being practical. These were minor issues not worth turning into friction. I'd learned long ago that objecting to small things can make you seem difficult, and I had no desire to be labelled that way. I'd built a reputation on being steady, and I didn't want to fracture it over moments that could be explained away with patience. So I adapted. When my wife made plans without checking in, I rearranged my schedule. When friends joked at my expense, I smiled along. When assumptions were made about what I'd contribute, time, effort, money, I fulfilled them quietly. Each time, I reassured myself that this was what partnership looked like, that flexibility was a strength. That is not everything required a response. But there's a cost to constant adjustment. The more I normalized these moments, the less noticeable they became to everyone else. What had once felt slightly off now registered as routine. The tone shifted from tentative to casual. From, "you don't mind, right?" to, "this works for you." From consideration to certainty. And still I said nothing. Part of it was fear, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Not fear of confrontation, but fear of disrupting the version of myself that others were comfortable with. I worried that speaking up would make things awkward, that it would cast me as overly sensitive, that it would expose how much I'd been absorbing without comment. So instead, I refined my justifications. I told myself that being calm was a form of control. Choosing not to react gave me the upper hand. That silence was evidence of emotional maturity. And on some level, I believed it. I'd seen how impulsive reactions damaged relationships. I'd watched people lose credibility by overplaying their grievances. I didn't want to be that person. What I didn't see yet was how my restraint was being interpreted, not as strength, but as permission. There were moments, brief, internal ones, where I felt something sharper rise up. A desire to correct the record, to assert that I was, in fact, part of the story being told about my own life. But those moments passed quickly, smoothed over by habit and logic. Everyone else seems fine, I'd think. Don't create a problem where there isn't one, except there was one. It just didn't belong to anyone else yet. By normalizing the disrespect, I taught the people around me how to treat me. I showed them where the boundaries weren't. And once boundaries are assumed to be flexible, they stop being consulted at all. The most unsettling part is how invisible this process feels while you're inside it. There's no single moment you can point to and say, this is where it went wrong. It's an accumulation, a slow erosion. And because it happens incrementally, you adjust your expectations alongside it. You stop expecting to be asked. You stop expecting acknowledgement. You stop expecting consideration. And you tell yourself that's fine. Looking back now, I can see how thoroughly I'd rationalized my own erasure. How invested I was in maintaining harmony at the expense of clarity. How deeply I'd tied my sense of worth to being agreeable rather than being seen. At the time, I believed I was choosing peace. What I didn't understand was that peace without mutual respect is just quiet surrender. And once that becomes normal, reversing it requires more than words. At some point, without anyone ever saying it out loud, my role was decided. I was the reliable one. The steady presence. The man who would always adjust, always accommodate, always understand. It wasn't a role I consciously accepted, but it was one I performed consistently enough that it became fixed in everyone else's mind, including my own. Once you're assigned a role like that, people stop interacting with you and start interacting with what you represent. I wasn't Noah with preferences, limits, or expectations. I was the constant, the buffer, the person who made things easier by not asking to be considered. In my marriage, this showed up in small but telling ways. Decisions about our social life were made before I entered the room. Invitations were accepted on my behalf. Time was allocated as if my consent were automatic. When I hesitated, even briefly, it was met with surprise, sometimes mild irritation, as though I'd deviated from a script everyone else had memorized. "You're usually fine with it," my wife would say. And I was, until I wasn't. But by then, the role had solidified. Among friends, the pattern was even clearer. I was the one expected to help without being asked twice, the one who filled in gaps, solved problems quietly, and never made it about himself. If someone else was moody or dismissive, it was excused. If I ever showed the slightest resistance, it stood out, because it contradicted the version of me they relied on. What struck me later was how little malice there was in any of this. No one sat down and decided to take advantage of me. They simply responded to what I consistently allowed. The role worked for them. It reduced friction. It made life smoother. And because I never challenged it, there was no incentive to reconsider it. I told myself that this was just how relationships evolved, that every group has its dynamics, that someone has to be the stabilizer. I even took a certain pride in it. Being needed, even quietly, felt like purpose. But need isn't the same as respect. The moment that crystallized this realization didn't arrive with drama. It came during an ordinary conversation, when someone referred to a future plan and casually said, "Noah will be there." Of course? Not as a question, not as a hope, as a fact. Everyone nodded, including me. And in that instant, I felt something shift, not outwardly, but internally. A quiet recognition that my presence had stopped being a choice in their minds. That my autonomy had been quietly overwritten by expectation. I wasn't angry, I wasn't hurt in a dramatic sense. I was clear that the role I'd been playing no longer reflected who I was. Clear that continuing to perform it would only deepen the disconnect between how I was seen and how I actually felt. Clear that something would eventually have to change, not through confrontation, but through action. Because roles like this don't dissolve when you complain about them. They dissolve when you stop fulfilling them. At the time, I didn't act on that clarity. Not yet. But I began to observe myself more honestly. I noticed how often I defaulted to agreement, how rarely I paused to ask what I wanted, how quickly I smoothed over my own discomfort to maintain an image of ease. And I began to understand that invisibility isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's rehearsed, practiced, reinforced. The role I was assigned worked because I kept showing up for it. The question that lingered, quietly, insistently, was how long I was willing to keep playing it. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no discovery, no moment where the air cracked open and forced a reckoning. It was an ordinary day, folded neatly into routine. And that's what made it so definitive. Nothing external demanded change. It came entirely from within. I was sitting alone in my car, parked outside the grocery store, hands resting on the steering wheel longer than necessary. I'd just finished a call with my wife. She'd informed me, casually, that she wouldn't be home that evening. Plans had come up. Nothing urgent. Nothing, she thought, required discussion. I remember saying okay without hesitation. The word came out smoothly, automatically, but after the call ended, I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, listening to the silence that followed. And in that silence, I noticed something unfamiliar. Not anger, not jealousy, not even sadness. It was a kind of detachment. A moment where I heard my own voice from the outside and realized how rehearsed it sounded, how conditioned. As if I'd been responding to the same prompt for years without ever checking whether it still aligned with me. I thought back through the past months, then years, and saw the pattern with startling clarity. How often I'd agreed without pause, how rarely I'd asked follow-up questions, how easily I'd accepted being informed instead of consulted. It wasn't just happening to me, I was participating in it. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal does. It steadied me. For the first time, I stopped framing the situation in terms of what others were doing wrong and started examining what I was enabling. Not with blame, but with responsibility. Because if I had more control than I'd been using, then I also had more options than I'd believed. I drove home slowly, thinking less about my wife's plans and more about my own boundaries. boundaries I'd never clearly defined, even to myself. I realized how much I'd relied on being understood without being explicit. How often I'd expected consideration without ever requiring it. That evening, alone in the house, I didn't distract myself. I didn't fill the quiet with noise. I sat with it, let it stretch. And in that space, something settled into place. I didn't need to confront anyone. Not yet. I didn't need explanations or apologies. What I needed was alignment between what I felt and how I acted, between the man I was internally and the role I was performing externally. The shift was subtle, but it was complete. From that day on, silence stopped being my default and became a choice. Not a passive one, but a deliberate one. I began to listen differently, to observe without immediately accommodating, to let moments linger instead of smoothing them over. Nothing changed right away, and that was intentional. I wanted to understand the full shape of the situation before altering it, to see how others behaved when I paused, when I didn't rush to reassure, when I let my presence carry weight simply by existing rather than compensating. What I noticed confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. People filled the space I left behind with assumptions, with confidence that I'd still comply, with comfort that nothing had truly shifted, and that told me everything I needed to know. Because real respect adjusts when it senses change. Entitlement ignores it. That day in the car wasn't dramatic. No one else would remember it. But it marked the end of something for me, the end of unconscious participation in my own diminishing. From that point forward, every silence had intention behind it. Every decision not to speak was paired with observation. I wasn't withdrawing, I was recalibrating, and I knew, quietly, unmistakably, that whatever came next would not be reversible. Once silence became a choice rather than a reflex, everything sounded different. I began to notice how quickly people filled gaps when I didn't respond immediately, how assumptions rushed in to replace dialogue. When I paused instead of agreeing, others often continued as if I had. It was almost automatic, proof of how firmly my role had been written into the script. And I let them, not because I was confused or hesitant, but because I was learning, watching, measuring the distance between what was said and what was meant, between what was offered and what was taken for granted. My wife noticed something first, though she didn't name it. She asked if I was tired, if work had been stressful. Her questions were practical, surface level. She wasn't asking what had changed, only whether something was wrong enough to require fixing. I told her I was fine. And I was, calmer than I'd been in a long time. I stopped preemptively smoothing over moments of discomfort. If a plan was mentioned without my input, I didn't rush to confirm it. I let it sit. If a joke landed at my expense, I didn't laugh automatically. I allowed the silence to do the work instead. That silence unsettled people more than I expected, not because it was confrontational, but because it disrupted the flow they were accustomed to. It forced awareness without accusation, and awareness, I learned, is uncomfortable for those who benefit from your predictability. What surprised me most was how often my restraint was misread. People assumed I was distracted, or disengaged, or quietly resentful. None of those were true. I was more present than ever, just no longer performing reassurance on demand. The more I withheld my automatic responses, the clearer the dynamics became. I could see who adjusted, who asked questions, who noticed the shift, and I could see who didn't. Those who respected me checked in. They recalibrated. They treated my pause as a signal. Others simply continued, confident that my silence still meant consent. That distinction mattered. I began documenting, not formally but mentally at first. Who reached out? Who didn't? Who included me when it was inconvenient? Who only remembered me when something needed to be handled? The pattern was consistent. And once you see a pattern clearly, it loses its power to confuse you. There was a strange relief in this phase. No confrontation, no emotional labor, just clarity. I didn't feel the need to correct anyone yet. I was no longer seeking to be seen. I was deciding who was worth being seen by. Silence, I realized, isn't empty. It holds information. It invites projection. And when chosen deliberately, it reveals far more than words ever could. From the outside, nothing appeared different. I was still present, still polite, still calm. But internally, I'd stopped volunteering myself into spaces where I wasn't fully considered. And that's when others began to mistake my quiet for weakness again. They assumed I was pulling back because I felt small, that I was waiting to be reassured, that I'd eventually step back into the role they preferred. They were wrong. What I was doing was choosing not to interrupt the momentum of their assumptions, because that momentum was carrying them somewhere they hadn't thought through. Somewhere they believed was safe. Silence became my way of letting the truth unfold naturally. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't strategizing a dramatic reveal. I was simply allowing reality to continue without my interference, and taking note of who benefited from that reality staying exactly as it was. By the time anyone realized I wasn't playing along in the same way, the distance between who they thought I was and who I actually was had grown too wide to bridge with explanations alone. And they seeking. That was intentional. While everyone else grew comfortable with my silence, I was becoming more attentive than ever. That was the part no one noticed. They saw the quiet and assumed nothing was happening behind it. They mistook my restraint for withdrawal, my stillness for disengagement. In reality, I was present in a way I'd never been before, alert, observant, and no longer emotionally invested in maintaining illusions. I started paying attention to details I'd once overlooked, patterns of behavior, inconsistencies in stories. The timing of conversations stopped when I entered the room and resumed when I left. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a picture that was difficult to ignore once it came into focus. My wife's schedule changed subtly at first. Later evenings, more last-minute plans, vague explanations delivered with confidence, as though clarity were optional. When I asked neutral questions, where, with whom, how late, they were answered, but without the texture they used to have. Less sharing, more summary. I didn't push. Instead, I listened. I noticed which details were repeated and which were glossed over. I noticed how often certain names came up, and how often they didn't, despite their implied presence. I noticed how her phone was angled away from me now, how notifications were checked quickly and dismissed. These were observations, not accusations. I made sure of that. I wasn't hunting for betrayal. I was letting behavior speak for itself. Outside our marriage, the same attentiveness applied. Friends spoke more freely around me now, assuming my quiet meant disinterest. Comments slipped through, half jokes, half confessions, that might have been edited in my presence before. I became, unintentionally, someone people underestimated in a different way, and that underestimation gave me access. I began to keep records, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically. Dates, times, discrepancies. Not because I needed proof yet, but because clarity requires grounding. Memory can be questioned. Patterns are harder to dismiss. The more I documented, the calmer I felt, not vindicated, not angry, just anchored. When you stop gaslighting yourself, the world becomes surprisingly steady. What struck me most during this period was how little effort it took to be overlooked. People are remarkably candid when they believe you aren't paying attention. They speak loosely, they assume continuity. They rely on your past behavior to predict your future in ways that suit them. No one asked what I was thinking. No one wondered what conclusions I might be drawing. They were comfortable with the idea that I wasn't drawing any at all, and so they continued. The irony is that if I had confronted anyone early, if I'd expressed discomfort or suspicion, it would have tightened the narrative. It would have prompted defensiveness, denials, and revisions. Instead, by remaining neutral, I allowed the truth to remain unguarded. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was collecting understanding. There were moments when I felt the pull to speak, to ask a pointed question, to disrupt the flow. But I resisted. Not out of fear, but out of discipline, because I wanted to be certain. And certainty doesn't come from fragments. It comes from accumulation. Over time, the picture sharpened. What had once felt like unease became coherence. The question was no longer if something was happening, but how long it had been normalized without my awareness. That realization didn't wound me the way I expected. It clarified me. I stopped wondering what I'd done wrong. I stopped searching for ways to be more accommodating, more understanding, more patient. Those tools belonged to a version of myself that believed being reasonable would be reciprocated. This version of me was different. I understood now that my silence had created a vacuum, and that vacuum had revealed who rushed to fill it with honesty, and who filled it with entitlement. The difference mattered. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting because I no longer needed to. I had all the information I required. I was no longer seeking reassurance or resolution. I was preparing for alignment. And alignment, once achieved, doesn't announce itself. It simply moves. The moment of certainty didn't arrive with shock. There was no racing heartbeat, No cold rush, no cinematic collapse of belief. What I felt instead was a quiet finality, the kind that settles in when the last missing piece slides into place and confirms what you already know. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was at home, alone, sorting through paperwork I'd been meaning to organize for months. Not searching for anything in particular, just doing what I'd always done, putting things in order. Among the documents was an old tablet we shared early in our marriage. It hadn't been used in years. I charged it out of mild curiosity, expecting nothing. What I found wasn't hidden. That was the part that struck me most. No elaborate secrecy, just neglect. Messages, not explicit, not dramatic, but unmistakably intimate in tone, familiar with rhythm. Conversations that assumed continuity, inside jokes, shared references, plans spoken about as if already understood, and there it was. The name I'd heard too often and too vaguely in recent months. In that moment, I didn't feel betrayed so much as relieved. Relieved that my instincts had been accurate. Relieved that the unease had a shape now. Because ambiguity is far more exhausting than truth, even when the truth hurts. I didn't scroll obsessively. I didn't dig deeper than necessary. I didn't need every detail. What I needed was confirmation, not for leverage, but for clarity, and I had it. I sat there for a long time after, the tablet dark in my hands, letting the understanding settle fully. There was no urge to confront, no impulse to call anyone. No need to do anything at all, because this wasn't the beginning of something, it was the end of my uncertainty. What followed surprised me even more. I didn't feel small, I didn't feel disposable. I felt steady, grounded, as though the fog that had been distorting everything had finally lifted, revealing a landscape that made sense. The private reveal wasn't about discovering an affair, it was about discovering where I stood, and more importantly, where I no longer needed to stand. I reviewed what I knew, quietly, methodically. I cross-checked timelines, not to trap anyone, but to ensure my understanding was complete. When you act from partial knowledge, you act emotionally. When you act from certainty, you act cleanly. And that distinction mattered to me. There was no celebration at this moment. No satisfaction, only acceptance. The kind that allows you to move forward without dragging unresolved questions behind you. I realized then that whatever conversation eventually came would not be about explanations. Explanations are for people still hoping to fix something. I wasn't. I was aligning my actions with reality. The leverage I gained wasn't legal or financial, at least not yet. It was psychological. I knew the truth, and the truth didn't require me to rush. It didn't require me to persuade anyone else. It simply existed. And because it existed, everything else could be handled in order. That night, when my wife came home, I greeted her the same way I always had. Calm, polite, observant. She didn't sense anything different, because nothing had changed on the surface. But internally, everything had. I slept well that night, better than I had in months, because certainty, even painful certainty, is restful. Knowing the truth doesn't tell you what to do with it. That was the realization that followed the private reveal. Certainty brings clarity, but it also brings responsibility. Once you know, you can no longer pretend that inaction is neutral. Every path forward becomes a choice, and every choice carries weight. I didn't rush into any of them. Instead, I allowed myself time to think, not emotionally, but structurally. I laid out the options the way I would any complex problem, clearly, clearly, honestly, without comforting illusions. I could confront her immediately, demand answers, force a reckoning. That path offered emotional release, but little else. It would give her time to reframe the narrative, to prepare defenses, to turn confusion into strategy. It would also put me in a reactive position, responding to what she said instead of acting on what I knew. I could pretend I hadn't discovered anything. Continue as before. Let the situation play out indefinitely. That option required the least effort in the short term, but it demanded the highest cost long term: self-respect. I had already crossed the point where ignorance was possible. Returning to it would be an act of self-betrayal. I could expose everything publicly. Not out of vengeance, but out of a belief that truth should be visible. But public exposure doesn't bring resolution, it brings spectacle. It entangles you in other people's opinions, forces you to perform your pain, and invites interpretations that dilute the reality of what happened. None of those options aligned with who I was becoming. There was a fourth option, quieter, slower, irreversible. I could act without announcement, not disappear, not punish, simply reposition myself, legally, financially, emotionally, before anyone else realized the ground was shifting. That path required patience and discipline. It offered no immediate validation, but it preserved my dignity and my control. That was the option I chose. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was guided by alignment. I understood now that the man I'd been, the accommodating, endlessly understanding presence, could not carry me forward. And the man I was becoming didn't need to explain himself prematurely. Once I made that choice, everything became simple. Not easy, but simple. I stopped weighing alternatives. I stopped second-guessing. I committed fully to the direction I'd chosen and focused on execution. Emotional turbulence gave way to focus. Regret gave way to resolve. There's a strange peace that comes when you stop asking what if and start asking how. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't grow distant or cold. Consistency was important, not to deceive, but to maintain stability while I prepared. The fewer disruptions there were, the fewer questions would be raised. At this stage, my silence wasn't just strategic, it was protective. It allowed me to act without interference, to think without distraction, to move without resistance. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to exit a reality that no longer fit, with my integrity intact. The decision point wasn't marked by drama, it was marked by calm, by a quiet understanding that the next steps would reshape everything, and that once taken, they couldn't be undone. And I was ready for that. Once the decision was made, I moved carefully, not cautiously, carefully. There's a difference. Caution comes from fear of being caught. Care comes from respect for consequences. I wasn't hiding out of guilt. I was acting out of precision. I started with the practical things. The unglamorous details most people ignore until they're forced to confront them emotionally. I reviewed our shared finances the way I would review a work project, line by line, without narrative. Accounts, automatic payments, shared liabilities, long-term obligations. I didn't change anything yet. I just needed a complete picture. What struck me was how much of the structure depended on my quiet maintenance. Bills routed through my systems. Records kept by habit rather than design. I had never leveraged that before, because leverage wasn't how I thought about responsibility. Now I saw it differently, not as power, but as awareness. I consulted professionals discreetly, not to escalate. Understand. I asked questions about options, timelines, and implications. I didn't share details I didn't need to. I listened, took notes, clarified assumptions. The goal wasn't to act immediately. It was to ensure that when I did act, there would be no surprises. At home, nothing changed on the surface. I cooked dinner. I asked about her day. I listened without interrogating. I remained present without offering more than was asked. That consistency wasn't an act. It was discipline. Emotional volatility would only cloud the process I'd committed to seeing through clearly. What changed was internal. I stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped interpreting gestures as signals of repair. I stopped investing in a future that required mutual honesty when I knew it no longer existed. Instead, I invested in preparedness. I organized documents, updated personal records, ensured access to what mattered. I took responsibility for my own continuity, something I'd assumed would always be shared. There's a misconception that moving in silence is manipulative. It isn't, at least not inherently. Manipulation seeks to control others' perceptions. Silence, in my case, was about not volunteering information before it was necessary. I wasn't deceiving anyone about my actions. I simply wasn't narrating them. Time passed. Days folded into weeks. And with each step completed, I felt less urgency, not because the situation was improving, but because my footing was solidifying. What I noticed during this period was how unobservant people can be when they believe nothing has changed. Small shifts went unnoticed. Boundaries adjusted quietly. Assumptions continued uninterrupted. That continuity created the space I needed. The wedding was approaching, a mutual friend's wedding. The one everyone had been talking about for months. The event that symbolized celebration, loyalty, and public unity. I knew by then that it would also be the moment when all the unspoken dynamics would sit in the same room. I didn't plan around the wedding. I didn't attach meaning to it yet. I simply included it in my timeline, like any other fixed point. What mattered was that by the time that day arrived, I would not be standing there uncertain, reactive, or exposed. I would be standing there prepared. Moving in silence isn't about hiding from the truth. It's about giving the truth room to work without interference. By the time anyone sensed something was different, the foundations underneath them would already be shifting. And not because I pushed them, but because I stepped out of the way. The first consequences didn't announce themselves. There were no arguments, no sudden revelations, no dramatic changes in behavior. What happened instead was subtler, an absence that couldn't be named yet, but could be felt. As I began withdrawing my quiet maintenance, small things started slipping. Not deliberately sabotaged, simply no longer preemptively handled. Reminders went unsent, schedules weren't smoothed over. Assumptions met neutral pauses instead of immediate compliance. At first, this was barely noticeable. My wife missed a payment deadline, not catastrophically, just enough to be inconvenient. A social plan became awkward when I didn't rearrange my time to accommodate it automatically. A minor logistics issue surfaced that I would normally have resolved before anyone else had to think about it. Each moment was insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a pattern of friction that no one could quite place. Confusion came before suspicion. She asked if everything was okay. Not with concern exactly, but with uncertainty. I assured her I was fine, which was true. I wasn't upset. I wasn't withdrawn. I was simply no longer compensating for things I hadn't agreed to manage. Friends noticed it too, though they didn't know what they were noticing. Plans felt less seamless. The man who usually filled gaps wasn't filling them, and because they'd never acknowledged that role openly, they had no language to question its absence. Instead, they adjusted, clumsily. What interested me was how quickly discomfort appeared once my presence stopped functioning as a buffer. The harmony I'd been credited with maintaining revealed itself to be conditional. It relied on my continued effort without recognition. Still, no one connected this to a bigger change. They assumed fatigue, distraction, temporary stress. The idea that I might be acting intentionally didn't register, because intentionality had never been part of the version of me they held, and I let that assumption stand. The wedding drew closer, and with it, a subtle escalation. My wife became more attentive in small ways. Questions returned. Casual check-ins increased, not out of guilt, out of instinct. She sensed an imbalance but didn't know its source. I didn't offer explanations, not because I was withholding truth maliciously, but because explanations invite negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating. The most telling moment came when someone else, one of our mutual friends, remarked offhandedly that I seemed different lately. The tone was light, curious, unthreatened. I smiled and said nothing, because different was the closest they could get without confronting what that difference implied. The consequences were unfolding not as punishment, but as exposure. Without my constant adjustment, everyone else had to face the reality of how much they'd relied on it. And that realization brought discomfort, but not understanding. Not yet. What I felt during this phase was not satisfaction, but distance. A growing separation between who I was and who they still believed me to be. That gap widened with each unaddressed assumption. By the time the wedding arrived, the atmosphere was subtly strained, not tense, just off. Like a familiar room with the furniture rearranged slightly. Nothing was wrong. Everything just felt less easy. And that was enough, because ease had always been my contribution. And without it, the truth of our dynamics had nowhere left to hide. By the time anyone realized something was truly wrong, it was already beyond repair. That's the nature of quiet change. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't demand attention. It simply advances, step by step, until the distance it creates can no longer be crossed in time. The first sign of panic wasn't dramatic. It came in the form of questions, soft ones at first. Are you upset about something? Did I do something? The tone was careful, exploratory, as if the problem might still be small enough to negotiate back into place. I answered honestly, but minimally. I wasn't upset. I wasn't angry. I wasn't confused. Those answers unsettled her more than any accusation would have. Anger can be addressed. Confusion can be clarified. Calm certainty leaves no obvious handle. She tried to re-establish familiarity. Small gestures returned. Conversations stretched longer. There was an effort, noticeable only because it hadn't been there before. But effort offered too late doesn't feel like care. It feels like a correction. And correction implies something went wrong suddenly. Nothing had gone wrong suddenly. It had been going wrong for a long time. Friends sensed it too. The dynamic felt unstable. They offered light commentary, suggestions. even jokes meant to ease the tension. No one named the issue directly because no one understood it fully. They were responding to the absence of something they'd never acknowledged as present. That absence couldn't be replaced with apologies or promises. It wasn't about a single mistake. It was about years of unbalanced expectations finally collapsing under their own weight. What struck me during this phase was how desperate people become when the roles they rely on start to dissolve. Not malicious, not manipulative, just uncertain. They reach for familiarity because familiarity feels safe, even when it's the source of the problem. My wife asked if we could talk things through. I agreed. We talked, calmly, respectfully. But talking assumes that dialogue is the missing piece. In our case, it wasn't. The missing piece had been mutual regard, and you can't retroactively install that once the structure has already shifted. I didn't accuse her. I didn't list grievances. I didn't present evidence. I didn't need to. The conversation wasn't about what she'd done. It was about what I was no longer willing to be. That distinction confused her. She offered explanations. Context. Framing. Not excuses exactly, more like attempts to re-establish common ground. But common ground requires shared assumptions. And ours no longer existed. She asked if this meant the end. I didn't answer immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of that question. It wasn't about the relationship. It was about whether the old equilibrium could be restored. It couldn't. I told her the truth, gently and clearly. That whatever happened next would not involve returning to how things were. That the version of me who absorbed everything quietly no longer existed. That was the moment she realized it was too late to fix it. Not because she hadn't tried hard enough in that moment, but because she hadn't noticed when it mattered. Because repair requires timing, and timing requires awareness. By the time awareness arrived, the foundation had already been reconfigured. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt closure.
And
closure, when it arrives without chaos, is unmistakable. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice. No accusations were laid out like evidence in a courtroom. No emotional surge demanding release. It unfolded the way difficult truths sometimes do. Quietly, with a clarity that leaves very little room for argument. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd shared meals, planned trips, and talked through ordinary problems. The familiarity of the setting stripped the moment of drama. This wasn't a battlefield. It was simply the place where reality was acknowledged. She spoke first, carefully. She asked what had changed. Not what she had done, what I had done. That question said more than she realized. It was assumed that the shift originated with me, as though the ground had moved without cause. I didn't correct her immediately. I told her that I had stopped pretending not to notice things. That I had stopped absorbing discomfort for the sake of smoothness. That I had stopped interpreting silence as peace. She listened, but I could see the tension in her face. Not defensiveness exactly, but confusion. She was trying to reconcile what I was saying with the version of me she'd known. The man who would usually soften statements like these, who would reassure her mid-sentence that everything was okay. I didn't do that this time. I told her calmly that I knew about the other relationship. I didn't present details. I didn't mention how or when. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement alone was enough. Her reaction wasn't explosive. It was still. A pause. A long breath. The kind of silence that follows when someone realizes the conversation they prepared for is no longer relevant. She began to explain. Not defensively, but urgently. Context. Loneliness. Miscommunication. Emotional distance. All the familiar pieces were arranged carefully, hoping they might form a bridge. I let her finish. Then I told her something that seemed to unsettle her more than anything else I could have said. I told her I wasn't angry. Anger would have kept us in the same frame. Two people arguing over who failed whom. Calm moved us somewhere else entirely. It reframed the conversation from blame to consequence. I explained that what hurt wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the assumption behind it. The belief that I would remain silent, accommodating, and present no matter how publicly I was disregarded. That assumption, more than the act, had broken something fundamental. She asked if there was anything she could do. I told her the truth. That there were things she could have done. But the window for them had passed. That statement wasn't meant to punish. It was simply accurate. You can apologize for a moment. You can't apologize for a pattern once it's fully revealed. We talked for a long time after that, about logistics, about next steps, about how to move forward with as little damage as possible. The conversation remained calm throughout, not because it was easy, but because there was nothing left to fight over. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with understanding. And understanding, in this case, was enough. When we stood up from the table, I didn't feel hollow. I felt steady, as though I'd finally spoken from the center of myself instead of from the edges. There was no victory in that moment, no satisfaction, just alignment. And alignment, once reached, doesn't require volume. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. That distinction matters to me. I didn't rebuild myself out of spite or reshape my identity in opposition to someone else's choices. What emerged after everything settled was simply a clearer version of who I had always been, one no longer diluted by accommodation or silence. For a long time, I thought strength meant endurance, staying steady, absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I believed that if I remained calm long enough, things would naturally balance themselves out. What I understand now is that endurance without boundaries isn't strength, it's erosion. The man I am now still values calm, still listens more than he speaks, still believes in restraint. But that restraint is no longer automatic, it's selective, intentional, grounded in self-respect rather than habit. I no longer confuse being easy to live with, easy to work with, easy to overlook, with being good. I've learned that when people never have to consider your limits, they eventually forget you have any. And forgetting your limits is the first step toward crossing them. My life now is quieter in a different way. There is less explanation, less justification, fewer attempts to smooth over things that don't sit right. I say no without over-explaining. I pause without apologizing. I let other people manage their own reactions instead of preemptively managing them for them. Some relationships didn't survive that shift, not because I pushed people away, but because they were built on an old version of me, one that no longer exists. Others grew stronger. Those were the ones that adjusted when I did, the ones that noticed, the ones that treated my presence as something to engage with, not assume. I don't resent the past. Even the parts that hurt taught me something essential. Awareness arrives when you stop numbing yourself to discomfort, when you stop telling yourself that noticing is the same as overreacting. The wedding, the image that anchors this entire story, no longer carries the same weight for me. It isn't a symbol of humiliation or loss. It's simply the place where I finally saw myself clearly in relation to others, where I understood, without denial, how public disregard feels different from private betrayal, and how quietly it can change you. What surprises me most now is how little I feel the need to explain any of this in my day-to-day life. I don't announce boundaries, I don't narrate growth, I just live differently, and the right people adjust without being told. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others, it's about control over yourself, about knowing when silence is wisdom and when it's avoidance, about choosing presence without surrender. I'm still calm, still measured, still not the loudest voice in the room, but I'm no longer invisible, and that difference changes everything. There's a reason I chose to tell this story without raising my voice. Not because the events didn't deserve emotion, but because the lesson in them only becomes clear when you strip the noise away. What happened to me wasn't sudden. It wasn't explosive. It was the result of something far more common and far more dangerous. Being quietly misunderstood for too long. Betrayal hurts differently when it's public. Not because more people see it, but because it confirms something you've already felt in private. That your presence has been reduced to a formality, that your dignity has been assumed to be unconditional. The cost of overlooking you is believed to be zero. The truth is, no one wakes up one day and decides to betray someone who has always been clearly present, clearly valued, and clearly respected. Betrayal grows in the spaces where boundaries were never enforced, not out of malice, but out of comfort. And comfort can be careless. This story isn't about punishment. It isn't about winning. It's about alignment. About the moment when you stop asking for understanding and start acting from clarity. When you realize that silence is only powerful when it's chosen, not when it's inherited from habit or fear. If there's a moral here, it's not speak louder or demand respect. It's this: be visible to yourself first. Notice when you're shrinking to maintain peace. Notice when your calm is being mistaken for consent. Notice when you're being praised for traits that make you easier to overlook rather than harder to dismiss. Because once you see that pattern clearly, you don't need confrontation to change it. You don't need revenge. You don't even need validation. You just need to stop participating in your own erasure. Some people will adjust when you do. Others won't. And that difference will tell you everything you need to know about who belongs in your life moving forward. I didn't lose myself in this story. I found myself, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. And that's why I can tell it now without anger. If you've listened this far, I want to leave you with one honest question. Not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Where in your life have you been staying silent? Not because it's wise, but because it's familiar. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Not your judgments, your experiences. Sometimes the most powerful clarity comes not from speaking alone, but from realizing you're not the only one who's seen this pattern play out. Thank you for listening.